What Ottoman Janissaries did to captured Christian boys was worse than you imagine. Every spring, between the years 1380 and 1648, Ottoman soldiers would descend on Christian villages throughout the Balkans with a specific mission. They weren't looking for gold. They weren't searching for land. They were hunting for boys. Christian boys, between the ages of 8 and 18, would be taken from their families, torn from their mothers' arms, while their fathers were held back at sword point. These children would never see their homes again. They would never speak their native languages again. Many would never even remember their own names. But what the Ottoman Empire did to these boys, what they transformed them into, was far more horrifying than simple slavery. Because these boys weren't just stolen, they were systematically erased, rebuilt, and turned into the most feared military force in history, a force that would eventually be ordered to conquer the very Christian lands they once called home. Show image of young boy being taken by Janissaries. This is the true story of the Devshirme, the Ottoman Child Levy. And what happened to these Christian boys was worse than you could possibly imagine. To understand the full horror of what we're about to discuss, you first need to understand what the Janissaries were. In Ottoman Turkish, the word Janissary comes from Yeniseri, which literally means new soldier or new troop. By the height of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, these Janissaries were the Sultan's elite infantry, the most disciplined, most feared, and most loyal soldiers in the entire Muslim world. They were bodyguards to the Sultan. They were the shock troops in every major Ottoman conquest. They were the ones who broke through the walls of Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire. They were the warriors who terrified all of Europe during the sieges of Vienna. But here's what makes them truly disturbing. Every single Janissary, every last one, was a Christian boy who had been forcibly taken from his family. The Devshirme system, which translates to collection or gathering, was established by Sultan Murad I around 1380. The policy was simple but devastating. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian provinces in the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, Bosnia, and parts of Hungary, and conduct what they called the blood tax. Local Christian communities were required by law to surrender 1 out of every 40 boys between the ages of 8 and 18. The strongest, healthiest, and most intelligent boys were selected. Families had no choice. Resistance meant death not just for the father, but for the entire village. According to Ottoman records preserved in the Topkapi Palace Archives in Istanbul, between 1380 and 1648, approximately 200,000 Christian boys were taken through this system. 200,000 children, stolen from their families, forced to convert to Islam, and transformed into soldiers for the very empire that enslaved them. But the physical taking of these boys, that was just the beginning of the nightmare. The selection process itself was psychologically brutal by design. Ottoman recruiting officers, accompanied by Janissary guards, they would arrive in a Christian village without warning, usually in early spring when roads were passable, but before harvest season when boys would be needed for farm work. The entire village would be assembled in the central square. All boys between 8 and 18 were lined up. Parents were forced to watch as Ottoman officials examined their children like livestock. According to a Serbian Orthodox priest named Konstantin of Ostrovica, who witnessed the Devshirme collection in 1438 and later wrote about it, the selection criteria were specific and cruel. Physical examination, boys were stripped to the waist. Officials checked for physical defects, scars, or signs of disease. Only the healthiest were taken. Intelligence testing, boys were asked to perform simple tasks, reading if they were literate, solving basic puzzles, demonstrating memory. The smartest were prioritized because they would become administrators and commanders. Family background checks, officials interviewed parents. Sons of priests were preferred because they were considered more educated. Orphans were rejected. The Ottomans wanted boys who had something to lose, whose families could be threatened if the boys didn't comply. The psychological test. This was the cruelest part. Officials would tell the mothers they could keep their sons if the boys cried or clung to them. Then they'd watch. Boys who showed fear or weakness were rejected. Boys who stayed silent, either from shock or from desperately trying to save themselves, were taken. Parents faced an impossible choice. Should they comfort their terrified child, knowing it might save him from being taken, but mark them as troublemakers? Or should they tell their child to be brave, knowing it made him more likely to be selected? Serbian historian Srdan Rudic documented a case from 1,503 inches, which a mother in the village of Novi Pazar convinced her son to act sick. Ottoman officials suspected deception, so they tested the boy by holding a knife to his throat. The boy's fear gave him away. Both mother and son were executed in the village square as a warning to others. Once boys were selected, they were immediately separated from their families. Parents were given no time to say goodbye. The boys were chained together in groups of 50 to 100 and marched to collection centers in Ottoman territory. According to Constantine's account, mothers would follow these caravans for days, walking alongside the chains, trying to speak to their sons. Ottoman guards would beat the women back, but many would try again the next day. Some mothers died from exhaustion on these roads, unwilling to lose sight of their children. The boys themselves were forbidden from speaking their native languages. From the moment of selection, they were permitted only Turkish. Those caught speaking Serbian, Greek, or Bulgarian were whipped. The psychological message was clear. You are no longer Christian. You are no longer from your village. You are no longer your parents' son. You are property of the Sultan. Once the boys arrived at the training centers primarily in Edirne, Bursa, and eventually Istanbul, the systematic erasure of their identities began. The process had 4 brutal stages. Stage 1. Religious conversion. Within 48 hours of arrival, every boy was forcibly converted to Islam. But this wasn't a simple ceremony, it was designed to psychologically break them. According to records from the Topkapi Palace, the conversion ritual worked like this. The boys were stripped naked and taken to a bathhouse called a hammam. While being bathed, their Christian clothes were burned in front of them, a symbolic death of their old identity. They were then circumcised without anesthetic. For boys aged 8 to 18, this was an excruciating and humiliating procedure. Many passed out from the pain. The Ottoman instructors considered this a test. Boys who screamed too much were marked as weak. After circumcision, they were given new Turkish names. Christian names like Dimitri, Pavle, or Constantine became Mehmed, Ahmed, or Suleiman. They were forbidden from ever using their Christian names again. A Turkish teacher would then instruct them in basic Islamic prayers. They were told that if they refused to pray, they would be beaten. If they continued to refuse, they would be killed. There are documented cases of boys who resisted being publicly executed as examples. But here's the most psychologically devastating part. The boys were told that their parents had sold them. Ottoman instructors would claim that Christian parents willingly gave up their children for money, that they were unwanted, that they'd been abandoned. This lie served a specific purpose. The Ottomans wanted to destroy any loyalty these boys felt toward their families and Christian communities. If the boys believed they'd been betrayed by their own parents, they would have no reason to resist their new identity. Stage 2. Cultural indoctrination. For the next 2 to 7 years, depending on age and aptitude, the boys underwent intensive cultural reprogramming. They were placed in barracks called Asimi Oglan schools, literally foreign boys' schools, where every aspect of their Christian upbringing was systematically replaced. Daily schedule, according to a 16th century Ottoman training manual: 4 a.m. wake up for Fajr, morning, prayer. 5 a.m. Turkish language instruction, beating for speaking native language. 8 a.m. Quran memorization, beating for mistakes. 12 p.m. noon prayer and meal. 1 p.m. physical training, running, wrestling, combat drills. 4 p.m. Islamic law instruction. 6 p.m. evening prayer. 7 p.m. weapon training, swords, bows, firearms. 9 p.m. sleep. This schedule continued 7 days a week, year after year, until their Christian memories faded. The boys lived in complete isolation from any Christian influence. They never saw their families. They never heard their native languages. They never celebrated Christian holidays. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, all were forbidden under threat of severe punishment. Instead, they were taught that Islam was the only true religion. They were shown Ottoman military victories as proof of Islam's superiority. They were told that Christians were infidels, including their own parents, and that conquering Christian lands was a holy duty. Stage 3. Military training. Once boys reached adolescence, the military training intensified. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers, they were an elite special forces unit. Their training was more rigorous than any other military force in medieval Europe. Training included weapons mastery, swords, daggers, bows, early firearms, arquebuses and muskets, physical conditioning, forced marches carrying 40-pound packs for 30 miles, psychological hardening, intentional food deprivation, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme weather, combat drilling, hand-to-hand combat, battlefield tactics, siege warfare, loyalty testing. Boys were ordered to kill animals, then prisoners, to desensitize them to death. According to French ambassador Jean de la Forêt, who visited Ottoman training facilities in 1535, the boys who excelled were promoted to officer positions. Those who failed physically were assigned to support roles, craftsmen, administrators, servants in the palace. But those who failed psychologically, those who showed lingering attachment to Christianity, or who questioned orders faced a darker fate. Stage 4, the final test. Before graduation into full Janissary status, each recruit faced a final psychological test. They were taken back to the region where they'd been captured, sometimes even to their home villages, and ordered to participate in raids or tax collection missions. The purpose was clear: force them to confront their past and prove their loyalty to the Sultan over any remaining ties to their Christian origins. There are multiple documented cases of Janissaries being ordered to burn down churches in their own villages, to arrest Christian priests, or even in the most extreme cases, to arrest their own parents for failure to pay taxes. A Greek chronicle from 1537 describes a Janissary named Mehmed, who was recognized by his mother during a raid on his home village in Thessaly. She ran toward him, calling him by his Christian name, Georgios. He pushed her away and ordered another Janissary to arrest her for interfering with military operations. She was imprisoned for 3 months. Whether Mehmed truly didn't recognize her or was following orders to maintain his cover is unknown. But the Ottoman system had worked. He chose the empire over his own mother. But the true horror of the Janissary system wasn't just what happened to these boys during training. It was what they became afterward. By the time they completed their transformation, many genuinely believed they were loyal Muslims and Ottoman citizens. The psychological conditioning had worked. There are documented cases of Janissaries encountering their birth families years later and not recognizing them, or worse, rejecting them. A Serbian Orthodox record from 1492 describes a priest who recognized his son, now a Janissary, in Belgrade. The priest approached him and called him by his Christian name. The son, now called Mustafa, reported his father to Ottoman authorities for spreading Christian propaganda. The priest was executed. Another account from Bosnia in 1526 tells of a Janissary who returned to his village during a military campaign. His mother was still alive. She begged him to remember his past, his real name, his Christian baptism. According to the chronicler, he replied, "I have no mother, I have no past. I serve only the Sultan." Some historians debate whether these Janissaries truly forgot their origins or were simply too afraid to acknowledge them. But psychological studies of modern child soldiers suggest that when children are taken young enough and subjected to intense indoctrination, their memories can be genuinely rewritten. The boys taken at age 8 or 9, after 10 years of training and indoctrination by age 18 to 19, would have only vague childhood memories. The human brain is malleable at that age. The Ottoman system exploited this. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that many Janissaries became perpetrators of the same system that victimized them. Once they became full Janissaries, they participated in the Devshirme collections. Former Christian boys would return to Christian villages to take the next generation of Christian boys. They would use the same methods that had been used on them, the same psychological manipulation, the same forcible separation, the same breaking of families. It was a cycle of trauma that perpetuated itself for nearly 270 years. But not every boy was successfully converted. Some resisted, even at the cost of their lives. Ottoman records mention these boys only briefly because rebellion was harshly punished. But Christian sources preserve their stories. A Greek manuscript from the monastery of St. John on Patmos documents the story of Constantine of Hydra, taken in the Devshirme of 1461 at age 10. Constantine refused to accept his new Turkish name, Ahmed. He refused to pray to Allah. He refused to eat meat, slaughtered in Islamic ritual. For his resistance, he was beaten daily. When beating didn't work, he was starved. When starvation didn't work, he was tortured, his hands were burned, his feet were whipped with metal rods. After 6 months of resistance, Constantine was brought before his entire training group. Ottoman instructors gave him one final chance: pray to Allah or be executed. According to the account, Constantine looked at his captors and said, "I am a Christian. I will die a Christian. You can take my body, but not my soul." He was beheaded. He was 11 years old. The Ottoman Empire considered such boys failures of the system. Christian communities considered them martyrs. But cases like Constantine's were rare. Most boys didn't have the psychological strength to resist years of systematic indoctrination. The Ottomans had perfected the art of breaking children's minds. Here's the ultimate bitter irony of the Janissary system. These stolen Christian boys, transformed into elite Muslim soldiers, eventually became so powerful that they destabilized the very empire that created them. By the 17th century, Janissaries had become a political force. They controlled succession to the throne. They assassinated sultans who displeased them. They staged military coups. They became corrupt, demanding bribes and special privileges. The children who had been taken to serve the Sultan now held the Sultan hostage to their demands. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally disbanded the Janissaries in an event called the Auspicious Incident, a polite name for a massacre. When Janissaries rebelled against military reforms, Mahmud ordered artillery to fire on their barracks, killing thousands. The system that had kidnapped, converted, and traumatized 200,000 Christian boys over 268 years ended in violence and bloodshed. But for the families who lost their sons, for the Christian communities that were terrorized generation after generation, the damage had already been done. Entire bloodlines were erased. Cultural knowledge was lost. The trauma of the Devshirme rippled through Balkan societies for centuries. Even today, genetic studies show the Ottoman impact. DNA analysis of modern Turks reveals significant Balkan and Slavic genetic markers, evidence of the thousands of Christian boys who became Ottoman and never returned home. So what happened to the Christian boys taken in the Devshirme? They were stolen from their families. Their identities were erased. Their religions were forcibly changed. They were psychologically broken and rebuilt as soldiers for an empire that saw them as tools, not humans. Some forgot their pasts entirely. Some remembered, but were too afraid to acknowledge it. A rare few resisted and died for their faith. But all of them, every single one, were victims of one of history's most systematic programs of cultural genocide. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was calculated, institutional, and refined over centuries. The Ottoman Empire built an entire military force on the stolen childhoods of Christian boys. And the worst part? It worked. The Janissaries conquered Constantinople. They pushed into Europe. They terrified Christian kingdoms from Vienna to Venice. And they did it all while commanded by men who were originally from those very Christian lands. The Ottoman Empire turned Christian boys into weapons against Christianity itself. That is what they did to captured Christian boys. And it was worse than you could have ever imagined. This is the history they don't teach. This is the truth they tried to forget.